President Cyril Ramaphosa says Ukraine is ready to commit to peace talks to end the three-year conflict with Russia, and that South Africa is willing to play a role in the negotiations. Diplomatic efforts in Europe to broker a peace deal between the two nations have so far been unsuccessful. Ramaphosa today hosted Volodymyr Zelensky at the Union buildings, but the Ukrainian president had to cut short his trip due to renewed Russian hostilities overnight. Qaanitah attended today's event and joins us now live. So he's ready, Qaanitah, President Zelensky, that is, to negotiate a deal. But what's stopping him? Does he have conditions? What exactly does he want?
Bravo, I think the important word is unconditional ceasefire. He says there has to be a ceasefire in place before they even get to the negotiating table. And we know that so far all the iterations of the deal has been a push for him to agree to something that's almost what President Ramaphosa described as preconditions. And President Cyril Ramaphosa weighed in on this, saying that any sort of precondition will not harbor well for the outcomes of peace talks. So when it comes to an actual ceasefire, Zelensky is saying that they are ready for unconditional ceasefire. It's now up to Russia to decide whether they're going to honor that so that they can actually just get to an effective peace table. And so the important bit now is that when Russia had proposed a ceasefire over the Easter period, Zelensky claims that Russia had violated their own ceasefire, and Ukraine had to respond as a result. And so the question is, who then becomes the guarantor of that ceasefire? President Cyril Ramaphosa saying he's ready to do it. Other African countries that were involved in that peace mission could do it. But Zelensky saying that they probably need someone with equal strength, a country with equal strength to Russia, to be the guarantor of that ceasefire agreement before talks continue. And he suggested that it could be a NATO country.
Well, it's interesting because one of the preconditions, as far as I understand, is that they should hold back on their ambition to form part of NATO, among other preconditions. Did President Cyril Ramaphosa say whether he actually raised, this matter of preconditions with the important people that he spoke to in this war, which is President Putin, Russian President Putin himself, but also the U.S. President, Donald Trump?
It didn't look like President Cyril Ramaphosa spoke about any specific things in these talks. He was talking principle. And so the principle is the war needs to end. The principle is that South Africa has been advancing is that war only ends through peaceful negotiation, and that there has to be unconditional cessation of hostilities so that talks can begin. President Cyril Ramaphosa referring to the example of South Africa and its talks to end apartheid, that there was no conditions on the table for the talks to begin. Now, the question goes to the elephant in the room, and that elephant in the room is one Donald Trump, because you know that U.S. President Donald Trump has been putting immense pressure on Volodymyr Zelensky to sign a deal. What does that deal include? That deal includes an acceptance of Russia's invasion of Crimea, is essentially ceding Crimea to Russia. And that is a huge sticking point, which Zelensky says that they cannot accept anything in negotiations that is against the constitution of Ukraine. And so the chronology of events is quite interesting. President Cyril Ramaphosa has a phone call with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He then has a conversation early hours of this morning with Donald Trump, who essentially wanted to speak about Ramaphosa's role in hosting Zelensky, and then hosting Zelensky later on today. And so, we asked the presidency about, this chronology and whether, this flurry of diplomatic activity had to do with some pressure that South Africa was facing around facilitating these talks. They said no. The president himself said that the talk with President Trump was long in the making. When we asked the Ukrainian foreign minister this, he says there's nothing incidental in diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't happen just on a whim.
Well, logic and common sense would suggest that, yeah.
But I mean, it's quite fascinating to see. I mean, essentially today was talks about talks, but a direction nonetheless for the world. There's been so much of movement that has led to nowhere in many dialogue forums in France, in in London and elsewhere, also in the US earlier on. And so Zelensky is saying that while the US may mock efforts to get to some resolution in the London talks yesterday, there is something that's sitting on Donald Trump's desk for his consideration, and they are saying that they welcome this bid to put pressure on Russia now to have unconditional ceasefire. Let's take a listen to what Zelensky had to say about moving the pressure from him to Russian President Vladimir Putin.
President Trump and the United States said that if one of the parties disagrees to a full ceasefire, and if other additional steps are not taken towards, then there will be time for some strong moves, sanctions included. This is what we understand, and this is what we perceive. We've accepted everything suggested by our partners, just excluding pieces that go against our constitution. Because the fight for our independence, for our sovereignty, for our territorial integrity, it's about actually our survival. And we are completely straight and transparent on that. I do not see any specific particular pressure on Russia. I don't hear of any new dedicated sanction packages against the Russian.
Of course, notwithstanding the overnight attacks on his country by Russia, which no doubt would have affected his mood, did he look like someone who is leaving or will be leaving South Africa with something to hold on to, or perhaps a more hopeful person than the person who arrived last night?
He looked jaded. I mean, President Zelensky looked concerned. He looked like the president of a country that just sustained attacks, and so his demeanor was not as cordial as you'd witness in some of these state visits. But it was not a state visit; it was an official working visit. One can understand that his country is obviously in war, but understanding, unpacking his comments with the foreign minister of Ukraine, it was interesting that they had deemed it quite significant, they had deemed it quite historic, and they are a little bit more optimistic that this visit could sort of, push talks in a particular direction. Now, the important bit here is what happens next. And there seems to be a little bit of, we're waiting for the US, we may go back to Riyadh or Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, where there was some iteration of peace talks happening there. But there isn't a clear path of this is the outcome of South Africa's intervention in this war, and this is what it will look like. And these things never happen that way.
Hopefully, at some point, we'll hear good news that indeed it was a visit worth everyone's while. But let's leave it there for now. Qaanitah, who of course has been following that story of the working visit by Volodymyr Zelensky.